Hello everyone, today I have here an 8GB RX 580 for testing. This is the ASRock Phantom Gaming X model. It appears to be a pretty decent budget version of the RX 580 with a simple aluminum cooler with 2 fans. And while it looks very modest, it is still a very capable RX 580 underneath that cooler, which is arguably one of the best price to performance cards that AMD has ever released. As a side note, taking the card apart for reapplying new thermal paste was also very easy, as all I had to do was take out these 6 screws in the back and the cooler comes right off. I will be pairing the 8GB RX 580 with my trusty old i7-4790K system, which I now have overclocked and running at a stable 4.7 GHz. Paired with the CPU is the 24GB DDR3 overclocked to 1800 MHz with CL10 timings and everything running on a generic SATA SSD. The operating system of choice is Windows 11 24H2 IoT LTSC with Spectre and Meltdown patches disabled for some extra gaming performance boost. I have also undervolted the RX 580 down to 1105 mV in order to help the thermals and lower the overall fan noise coming from the card itself. The gaming footage is recorded using OBS via the hardware H.265 acceleration that is found on the RX 580. As many of you no doubt already knows, the RX 580 and its near identical twin, the RX 480, are some of the best budget price to performance graphics cards that you could have bought back in the 2016-2018 era. And they all specifically targeted 1080p gaming at 60 plus FPS. The AMD cards also have great DirectX 12 and Vulkan renderer support, making them somewhat future-proof with non-ray tracing exclusive games. The excellent Vulkan support combined with open source community drivers also makes these AMD GPUs rather great for Linux gaming, but that testing is perhaps best left for another video. The RX 580 and 480 were usually sold with 4GB of VRAM, and the 8GB models were generally seen as excessive and not really worth the extra cost back when they were first released, but with more modern games released after 2022, the 8GB buffer becomes a necessity just to be able to launch them in the first place. Without further ado, let's start with the 3D Mark benchmarks. The Firestrike benchmark returns a general score of 11,500, GPU score of 13,913, and physics score of 12,836 with a combined total score of 4,681. The TimeSpy benchmark returns an overall score of 4,288, graphics score of 4,205, and a CPU score of 4,832. And finally, thanks to our 8GB of VRAM, we are able to run the Steel Nomad benchmark, which returns a score of 955. Switching to gaming benchmarks, let's start with Counter-Strike 2, which I could only use the Steam overlay to see the performance metrics during an online match. At 1080p native with every single graphics setting set to their absolute lowest, the average frame rate was between 120 and 140, with 1% lows which were somewhere between 60 and 80 during an online deathmatch in the rather intensive Ancient map. However, I did notice some odd stuttering randomly occurring during the first few minutes of the match, most likely being shader compile stuttering, and I did check other benchmarks on YouTube which also had the same stuttering with the RX 500 series of graphics cards. This perhaps indicates a driver side issue with the latest AMD drivers for the Polaris range. Nevertheless, the average and 1% low performance here was really good for our system, and a player more skilled than me would no doubt be able to have fun playing competitive modes in lower or middle tier ranks with ease. Up next is the Witcher 3 Next Gen upgrade, or the DX12 upgrade as I like to call it. This newer version of the game is considerably more demanding on the graphics card compared to the original DirectX 11 version that came out back in 2015, but also has noticeably better lighting quality and superior anti-aliasing. Using the high graphics settings with the annoying post-processing effects such as vignette and chromatic aberration, plus the Nvidia exclusive hair settings turned off, at 1080p native with TAAU anti-aliasing setting, the average frame rate was 30 FPS with 1% lows of 27 while riding through the city of Novigrad. This rather console-like remarkably stable frame rate can be enjoyed using a gamepad, or one could opt to use some of the medium settings plus a bit of resolution scaling to help out the RX 580 reach 60 FPS. Regardless, the DX12 version of The Witcher 3 is running well on our system and is looking great while doing so. Resident Evil 7 running on the DX12 renderer at 1080p native with the highest graphics settings possible with the exception of the ray tracing effects reaches an average frame rate of 101 with excellent 1% lows of 75. I have also noticed that with Resident Evil remakes that the screen space reflection option looks kind of hideous and super distracting compared to the good old cube map reflections when you turn them off. So I would personally recommend turning off that particular effect for higher performance and arguably better visuals in the absence of ray traced reflection options. The section I benchmarked here is from a latter portion of the game with some heavy combat encounters, and I did my best to use weapons with lots of special effects that could bring down the frame rate. But alas, Capcom has done some amazing optimization work with this game, and it is nearly impossible to drop our frame rate below our monitor's 75Hz refresh rate. Moving on to Dying Light, the excellent open world zombie parkour 'em up with excellent visuals, we are getting an average of 66 FPS with 1% lows of 51 while running around the starting map in the fictional city of Haran. Using 1080p, the graphics settings are set to their respective highest, the view distance is close to the 50% mark, and the Nvidia branded graphics features are all turned off. The RX 580 is really quite impressive in this title, as 2015 era appropriate GPUs for this game had to turn down most of the settings in order to reach 60 FPS mark. The only thing I don't like about this game is the built-in anti-aliasing. It is slightly too blurry for me and what I presume is FXAA, and at the same time it does a really bad job of clearing out stair-stepping. I would personally turn it off and use a custom solution via Reshade. A properly configured SMAA would look leaps and bounds better than the in-game anti-aliasing. Metal Gear Solid 5 with its Blackmagic levels of optimization averages 59 FPS with 1% lows of 52 at 1080p with all of the graphics settings at their respective maximum. I'm sure the RX 580 would have reached even higher frame rates, but unfortunately this game appears to be locked to 60 FPS, which I had no idea. I used to play it hovering around 40-ish FPS at medium and high settings combined back in the day. Totalwar Warhammer 1 running on the ultra settings at 1080p with no MSAA proves no challenge for the RX 580 as it averages 56 FPS with 1% lows of 45 during the 2 battle benchmarks. While the campaign map benchmark and my late game map save averages 49 FPS with 1% lows of 40. I played this title at medium settings at 1080p with about 30 FPS when it came out and was super happy about it. And then we have here the RX 580 experience, both looking great and doubling the performance. My only complaint is that, again, the not so good FXAA anti-aliasing implementation in the game. Some reshade SMAA injection is most certainly recommended. Doom 2016 running on the Vulkan renderer at 1080p using the Ultra preset reaches an average frame rate of 128 with 1% lows of 92 while playing the initial portions of the Foundry level. Reaching that buttery smooth 120 plus FPS at ultra settings makes the RX 580 an impressive high refresh rate experience for demon slaying. Bethesda's Fallout 4 defaulted to the Ultra preset at 1080p, but I have opted to drop the God Ray settings down to low as it is for some reason the most demanding setting in the entire game. Running around the Diamond City averaged 74 FPS with 1% lows of 56. The RX 580 proves to be an excellent choice to play this nice looking Fallout themed FPS open world crafting survival spin-off. Since this is a Bethesda game, I did not dare disable the VSync in-game as it usually results in things flying all over the map and the physics engine just completely breaks down. I usually don't play racing games, but 2015's Dirt Rally was really able to captivate me back when it first came out. The game running at 1080p using the Ultra preset with 4x MSAA on top proves no challenge for the RX 580 as it manages to reach an average frame rate of 105 with 1% lows of 85. This makes sure that any and all mistakes during the race are on the player's part and cannot be blamed on the GPU. I tested the finals at 1080p FSR 3.1 native with lowest settings and textures set to epic with anti-aliasing at medium and averaged 54 FPS with 1% lows of 40, which was not really optimal for a fast-paced online shooter. Then I switched to FSR 3.1 balanced and got a much better 83 FPS average with 1% lows of 52, and while the image looks a bit soft with FSR 3.1 balanced, the finals has probably the best FSR 3.1 implementation in a game that I have ever seen, so it is very much playable. Hi, here's a quick self-promotion. If you've enjoyed watching my content, why don't you consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel? Thanks in advance! Here we have another game with amazing optimization and superb visuals. Alien Isolation running at 1080p with all of the settings at their respective maximum values reaches an average of 144 FPS with 1% lows of 103. While the RX 580 here is able to provide an excellent high refresh rate experience, I have read online that the high FPS can break some of the game logic and AI behaviors, and some people have recommended capping the frame rate somewhere around 100 FPS to prevent the problems. So in a way, we can say that the RX 580 is just too powerful for this game. Dark Souls 3 at 1080p with all of the settings at their maximum averages a nearly locked 60 FPS with 1% lows of 54 when playing from the start of the game all the way to the second bonfire on the high wall of Lothric. We can see from the MSI Afterburner overlay that the RX 580 is constantly maxed out at 100%, indicating that it is just on the edge of being able to deliver that 60 FPS at the game's frame rate limit. Prey 2017, one of the best immersive sims you can play out there, at 1080p with all of the settings at their respective maximum, manages an average of 95 FPS with 1% lows of 40. This CryEngine title manages to look absolutely gorgeous and also runs great at the same time. Definitely recommended to the fans of science fiction and anyone who might enjoy the idea of a true FPS RPG hybrid game where nearly everything is systems driven and very few things are hard-coded or scripted into the game. The original 2019 version of Metro Exodus at 1080p native using medium quality preset with all of the Nvidia branded features turned off manages to reach an average frame rate of 88 with 1% lows of 51, all the while managing to look absolutely stunning. I would also like to praise the excellent use of temporal anti-aliasing in this title. It manages to avoid being too blurry and also manages to eliminate stair-stepping and shimmering artifacts at the same time. I have always enjoyed playing the Metro titles as they provide really immersive single-player experiences with visuals that are nearly half a decade ahead of their contemporary games with great performance on budget GPUs. We have here a Medieval running on the Unreal 4 engine at 1080p with the Epic preset, managing to average 140 FPS with 1% lows of 106. The only thing we can't run on this game is the ray tracing mode, which the RX 580 unfortunately does not support. Another Unreal 4 engine showcase is Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice running at 1080p using the very high quality preset. The RX 580 manages an impressive average of 51 FPS with 1% lows of 19, which are most likely shader compile or loading stutters. Hellblade is a really gorgeous looking interactive movie rather than a traditional video game, but it is an enjoyable experience if you are in the mood for some medieval Nordic fantasy setting with some spooky atmosphere. Similarly to a Medieval, the only settings that I did not enable here are the ray tracing settings. Speaking of Medieval, we have here Kingdom Come Deliverance running at 1080p native with the high preset plus the texture settings set to very high since we have the 8GB of VRAM buffer to work with. The RX 580 manages to hold an average frame rate of 65 with 1% lows of 45, which is really impressive for this open world CryEngine title. My only quaint complaint here is the anti-aliasing setting makes the game a little too blurry for my taste. I would most certainly choose to add some sharpening filter of some sort through the GPU control panel or using reshade. Here is my number one favorite open world crafting survival game of all time, Subnautica, and it manages to average 67 FPS with 1% lows of 48, running at 1080p native with the high preset. As I understand, this game running on the Unity engine has some performance issues that are inherent to the engine itself, which is totally fine as the game requires very minimal arcade reflexes and has no combat to speak of. So even at 30 FPS, it would be comfortably playable from start to finish. Remedy's 2019 mind-bending spooky third-person shooter Control manages to reach an average frame rate of 73 with 1% lows of 10. Using the DX12 renderer, the game was set to 1080p native with medium settings. texture and texture filtering settings were set to their respective maximum thanks to the 8GB VRAM buffer, and MSAA was completely turned off as it is redundant with the game's forced TAA. I am unsure, but I have some reason to suspect that the 1% lows were due to either shader compile stutters or area loading stutters. Nevertheless, the game was buttery smooth and looked visually stunning. Well, maybe except the screen space reflections. Much like the Resident Evil remakes, I think SSR looks worse and distracting compared to the good old cube map reflections, and since we don't have ray tracing support on the RX 580, I would personally turn off SSR to gain a bit more performance and much cleaner looking visuals. The excellent narrative-focused survival RPG hybrid Pathologic 2 manages to reach an average of 57 FPS with 1% lows of 18 using the fantastic preset at 1080p native resolution. The starting portion of the game, which I benchmark, has more effects going on compared to the regular game itself and is slightly more intensive. Besides, the game has an excellent art direction combined with great looking visuals, making the RX 580 an ideal GPU to play this game at nearly 60 FPS. Resident Evil 2 Remake is next, using the DX12 renderer at 1080p and nearly all of the settings at high except the volumetrics, which is at medium. We are able to see an average frame rate of 90 FPS with 1% lows of 65. Again, I would personally turn off the SSR for more stable looking reflections, but other than that, RE2 Remake looks visually stunning and runs buttery smooth. Doom Eternal here, one of my favorite games to benchmark, running at 1080p Ultra preset, reaches an average frame rate of 90 with 1% lows of 65, which is a really nice balance of good looking visuals and fluid frame rates for demon slaying. You could also set the preset to medium with texture related settings to Ultra or even Nightmare with the 8GB VRAM buffer, and probably push past the 100 FPS mark if you plan on playing at higher difficulty levels. Another CryEngine staple of the benchmarks, Hunt Showdown, does not officially support the RX 580 anymore after the 1896 update a few years back. But regardless, the RX 580 can still run the game just fine at 1080p with textures at high setting, 8x anisotropic filtering, lighting quality at high, anti-aliasing using SMAA 2TX, and everything else set to low. We can see that the frame rate averages 73 FPS with 1% lows of 57. This makes the game certainly playable, but one might want to consider perhaps quality FSR or simply lowering the resolution to around 900p in order to get a bit more competitive 90 to 100-ish FPS. Oh, and for anyone looking to undervolt their GPU, Hunt Showdown and Doom Eternal are both great games to test for instability, as both games will just crash or hang in about 10 to 15 minutes of gameplay if your undervolt is unstable. Mafia 1 Remake, the definitive edition, using the highest settings at 1080p, manages to average 64 FPS with 1% lows of 37, which is really more than enough for the single-player narrative-focused period piece. The remake is incredibly faithful to the original 2001 Mafia, while sanding out some of the frustrating edges of the original. Highly recommended to anyone who wants to play a 1930s New York-inspired gangster story. The Lords of the Fallen reboot, which is a very serious competitor to the From Software's Souls franchise, manages to average 61 FPS with 1% lows of 45 at 1080p native using mostly medium and low settings with textures set to high. I have also tried using FSR balanced and quality modes, but honestly the options menu might be bugged out as I have no idea if I was able to apply the settings or not. The frame rate was just going all over the place when I applied FSR, and you might have to restart the game in between graphics settings changes in order for them to properly work. As a really demanding and rather great looking Unreal 5 engine game, the RX 580 is really punching above its weight being able to run this game with mixed settings. My only complaint is the use of the default Unreal Engine motion blur, which has weird streaks and ghosting behind objects. Resident Evil 8 Village continues the tradition of being well optimized by averaging 89 FPS with 1% lows of 56. The game is running at 1080p with the graphics set to a mix of high and medium and textures set to high as possible without going over the VRAM limit. With the exception of SSR, the game is visually stunning with great art direction, able to capture that Black Sea region village aesthetic plus the snowy mountaintops with gothic castles added as extra visual distinction. The Callisto Protocol, another Unreal 4 engine visual showcase set to the medium settings with textures on high, averages 65 FPS with 1% lows of 30 when running the in-game benchmark. While the game is kind of a disappointment on the gameplay department, the Unreal 4 engine here is being pushed to its absolute limits in terms of visual quality, and it is hard to not be impressed with the visual fidelity that is present here, running 60 plus FPS on our modest RX 580. Callisto's bigger cousin, the Dead Space Remake, running on the equally impressive Frostbite engine with much better gameplay, with settings at 1080p FSR2 balanced using the low preset, manages to average 37 FPS with 1% lows of 21 in the intro cinematic. It should be noted that the intro cinematic is much more demanding compared to the actual gameplay portions, so we can expect somewhere between 45 to 55 FPS averages in our normal gameplay. The spiritual sequel to SWAT 4, Ready or Not, at 1080p using the medium preset with epic textures gave us an average frame rate of 67 with 1% lows of 45, which strikes a really nice balance of good looking visuals and fluid responsive frame rates. The Resident Evil 4 remake here is finally where the RX 580 hits the limit and falls below the 60 FPS average. At 1080p native with most settings set to medium and the textures set as high as possible without going over the VRAM limit, we get an average FPS of 56 and 1% lows of 36. And while the game felt very much playable, I was really struggling to hit my shots during the heat of the moment, but that could perhaps be blamed on me using a controller as opposed to a mouse for this game. Adding a tiny bit of FSR upscaling, perhaps quality or maybe even balance, would get us over the 60 FPS mark and into the more comfortable playable territory. I just realized how many survival horror games I tested here, but here is another one. The reboot of the granddaddy of all survival horror games, the Alone in the Dark reboot, provides us a surprisingly story-focused Lovecraftian survival horror experience with great visuals thanks to the Unreal 4 engine. The game at 1080p native with the high preset and epic textures averaged 60 FPS with 1% lows of 10, which were most likely area loading stutters that were not the fault of our RX 580. Pushing our entire system to its absolute limits, CPU and GPU, is the Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2 at 1080p, all settings at their lowest except for textures which are set to high, still manages to look visually stunning but runs at a console-like 36 FPS with 1% lows of 25. This is still a very respectable outcome for our RX 580, as this game really demands a more modern 2021 onwards PC hardware to truly push it past the 60 FPS average. And the last benchmark on our list is the legendary 2007 version of Crysis using the DXTend renderer running at 1080p very high settings with 4x MSAA and manages to reach a very respectable 84 FPS average with 1% lows of 44. I enjoy including the original Crysis in the benchmarks since it is sort of a traditional with PC gaming benchmark videos, and the game is really rather intensive at the highest settings even on more modern hardware. This video has been more focused on testing the RX 580, but my secondary goal here was to also test the 4.7 GHz overclock on the i7-4790K, and on that front I can confidently say that the overclock has been a success and has been stable in all of these benchmarks. The RX 580 turns out to be a very capable 1080p card, and the added benefit of the 8GB VRAM has aided its longevity and its capability to play modern games released after 2020s into the PS5 console generation. The only games that I thought was not giving me enough performance were the Finals and the Space Marine 2. With the Finals, a little bit of FSR really solves the problem, and Space Marine 2 might be built from the ground up for graphics card architectures released after 2020s. Going forward, I think the RX 580, especially the 8GB model, is still going to be able to handle traditionally raster rendered games quite well, with maybe using some FSR3 upscaling to help it reach 60 FPS. But if developers decide to go fully ray tracing in the future, that's where I think the RX 580 is just going to have to be retired, unfortunately. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. Please leave a like and comment on the video if you did. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more similar content in the future. I am thinking of doing some Linux testing with this system with the RX 580 next, so stay tuned for that. Please take care of yourselves, and goodbye.